Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So it's week 4, and we're looking at point of view. And let's talk about the stories for this week. You have some interesting choices. The first one is Strawberry Spring by Stephen King, and the second one is Everyone's Favorite Blonde. Now, you can, if you have time this week, read both. One is about 6 pages, one is about 7, and they're both interesting for their own reasons. So let's jump in. And then we'll talk about the instructive text for this week, where I give you some samples of before and after, first draft and final draft. So Strawberry Spring. A lot of people know Stephen King for his novels and the movies, successful or not, based on those novels. But many people, I don't think, realize just quite how many short stories he's published. He's quite almost as prolific with short stories as he is with novels. Some of them were published independently, and some were published in collections. So Strawberry Spring, compared to some of how long of a career he's had, it's a little bit of an older story, one not many people are familiar with. It is set in 2 different time periods, 1968 and then also 8 years later. And I think it was published in the 80s. I don't think it was published in the 70s. So before I get into point of view, some of the things to look for here. There are some setting details that come out a little bit slowly. We also have some interesting period details to kind of draw you in, to make you feel like you're in 1968. As always with Stephen King, you have the songs that are playing, so you have kind of a soundtrack. Hey Jude is playing endlessly, Scarborough Fair, Love is Blue, and then from this kind of idea that you're on this college campus, it's the 60s, it's like Summer of Love kind of thing. We have some violent events occurring that have a really interesting juxtaposition to what you think the setting is like. And so those are some details to look for. We're not talking about setting quite yet, but I wanted you to think about that. We have a number of characters, many of whom we don't really get to know for reasons that I don't want to say because I don't want to give the story away. But I guess I can say at least it is a Stephen King story, so there are some people who die. So we have some names of people, a few details, and it's interesting. You know, a lot of people, and I've talked about this too, many times you don't want to just tell, you want to show. In this case, because of what's happening, the narrator, and getting now into the point of view, the narrator is telling you details about these individuals. So you really only get the characterization of these women from, and a few men that he's talking about, but you only get them from his point of view. So he's going to say things like, he was a junior, he was going back to his dorm, and then he found this, and then this happened, and so there's a little bit of telling going on. Now, what's interesting is I think he's using that partially because this is a short story and not a novel, so we don't have the room to really show each event as it happens in great detail, but also the point of view is quite important. We have, and this is the reason I chose this story, an unreliable narrator. And the reasons for his unreliability become clear at the end of the story. But essentially, he's telling you these details, and at first, it seems like, okay, this is what happened and this is what occurred. And as the story goes on, you're kind of like, well, that detail doesn't sound right. Or that is kind of an odd way to look at that event, or is that actually what happened? So there are things kind of left out, there are things told in kind of a strange way, and you kind of as you're reading it, question what the narrator is telling you, the reader. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words a little bit, but that's essentially what you're going to be looking for. And I think, now there are many stories that are told with an unreliable narrator, but this story in particular, it is done in a little bit of a masterful way so that you're drawn in terms of plot. There's an inciting incident. We have more incidents occurring leading up to this climax, and you're kind of, a little bit similarly to Lambda Slaughter, you're kind of pulled in from this point of view because you're intimately connected to the person telling you the story. And these things are taking place during this very interesting strawberry spring, which is explained what that is, when it occurs, how it occurs. That's part of the setting and a little bit of part of the mood of the story. But really, the biggest, the most prominent technique to look for is that unreliable narration. And maybe you don't think it works. Maybe you think that by this point, you've seen things with an unreliable narrator, things like Gone Girl or Girl on the Train, two pretty prominent stories that came out recently that have unreliable narrators. Maybe you've seen things like that and you just feel like, it's kind of been done. There's not really a twist. There's not really anything to see. But for me, I really like the story, and I think that the narration is what carries it. So Everyone's Favorite Blonde is by Fernández Melchor. It was originally written in Spanish, and the reason that I chose this story for you is that it is told from multiple first-person point of view. So we have this woman, Evangelina, and we have various people telling different parts of her story from their perspective. So we've got Miguel, who is a retired man. We have Jose, the journalist. We have Daniel, a gang member. We have Teja, the director of social rehabilitation. And I believe that they are all men, which is kind of interesting. And there is a little bit of a prologue almost to this story to kind of set the mood and set the scene. It's told from an interesting point of view as well, and it's just kind of a description. But we have: the center of Veracruz is full of ghosts. My father says every time we pass by the ruins of the Melchor's first home in Veracruz, a gloomy residential complex. And so it's almost like, what happened there? Why is it gloomy? And then we get into the story of this woman and what she's been accused of. So what I find fascinating about this story, the point of view from each person is very clear. They each have kind of a different vocabulary, a different way of talking, a different way of describing. The characterization of Evangelina comes through differently depending on who's looking at her and telling this story. So Miguel, who is presumably older, right? He is talking about what she was like as a child. She had a waxen complexion, well-defined cheekbones, and he's giving these details of then how she kind of met up with posh kids who are taking drugs and all of this kind of thing. You can kind of see this old retired guy, like, here's how she was as a child, and then she got involved in these druggies, and this is what happens, right? Then we have Jose, the journalist, who looks at things from a journalistic point of view. He is describing things in such a way. He's in a courtroom. He's describing the courtroom, and he is using some profanity, which Miguel does not. So he's got quite a different style of telling this story. Then when we move into Daniel, the gang member, much less interested in those imagery journalistic details. And he's like, I don't think she did it. She's not a violent person. Sure, she was kind of like a junkie or whatever, but so you can kind of hear his voice coming through. And then finally, with the director of social rehabilitation, she finishes up the story by really focusing on things like things that a social rehabilitator would focus on, right? And I don't want to give away too many details there because she's telling the end of the story. And then we have a little bit of a space, and I think, can't be sure, but I think the first person from the prologue then writes this final sentence of this story. So what can you learn from this story? How to have characters sound different, the importance of having a diversity of point of view, and diversity here, you know, all of these people, it's a story set in Mexico, so I don't mean diversity in that way. What I mean is a social worker, a gang member, a journalist, a person from her neighborhood. This gives us a very interesting picture about, and we learn just as much in terms of characterization. We learn just as much almost about them because of the things that they choose to focus on. We learn about them almost as much as we learn about Evangelina. So it's a great story. It's something that I don't think a lot of people have seen, particularly since it was originally published in the 1980s. It was originally written in Spanish, but it's a really interesting look, and not many short stories use multiple first-person point of view effectively. At least it's more done in novels where you have the room to do that. So it's really interesting that every word counts in a short story. I should have said that week 1. Now we're in week 4, but every word counts, and that's an important thing to note. And it's done really masterfully here. So, let's talk about our mentor or our instructive text, the creative writing sample on point of view. So, welcome to Irma the Inventor. Irma the Inventor is a children's book originally written for kids, grades about 4 to 6, maybe a little bit younger than one of the excerpts we looked at last week. So this is from an author that I worked with where I was her editor. The problem with the first version of this book is that the point of view is not consistent. And you can have shifts between first and third if there is a reason. You can have multiple first-person points of view as long as it's consistent. So they change every chapter or every 2 chapters. Or I've seen some books where they have a little thing of first person as kind of a snippet in the beginning, and then the rest of the chapter is written in third person, right? What happened with this book is that we really have shifts that are quite confusing. So chapters 1 through I think 4 are in third person, and then chapter 5 is in first person, and it doesn't quite fit. There are some other issues too in terms of this first person material is from a side character. So the protagonist is Irma. Dilly is her best friend, and Dilly in the book is an important character, a main character, but not really the protagonist. And so what ended up happening is we're following the protagonist along for 4 chapters, and then this other character comes in and kind of takes over the story for a chapter or 2, and then it goes back to the protagonist. And so it was kind of confusing to me as an adult, and it definitely would have been confusing, I think, for kids, especially since there wasn't any marker or reason for that happening. So the final version, you can see this chapter rewritten. She took the time when she took out that first person point of view, she rewrote it all in third. She was able to really focus a little bit more on the protagonist, but also some of the themes of the book. It's a STEM novel for girls, so it's about science, technology, engineering, math, all those fun, exciting things that some of you as aspiring authors are like, no. But it's a STEM novel for girls, so she was able to kind of focus on that a little bit more. There's some bullying that goes on. There's a little bit of backstory of some of the other characters. So our antagonist is not completely a villain, and we get backstory about her, and she's made more sympathetic, and she's not really an antagonist by the end of the story. She really becomes one of their friends. We have things that are a little bit more age appropriate. Some of the first person stuff was more for younger kids. So what I encouraged the author to do, and I don't think I put this in the actual text that I gave you, but what I encouraged her to do was to save those stories from first person and rework it eventually into something for younger children. And I don't know if she ended up doing that, but I know that she instead on her website, I know for sure she has like outtakes or like deleted scenes from the book. And so the consistency and point of view is something that people struggle with a lot when they're first writing, and I think that this is a great example of why consistency is needed and how to use a consistent point of view to your advantage as a writer. So I hope that you learned from all of our texts this week, and I can't wait to see what you come up with in terms of your story featuring point of view, which point of views you're going to take, and how you're going to show characterization or not if it's in third person. That's it. Thanks, everybody.